In 1947, thousands of Japanese women stepped off ships in American ports, clutching small suitcases and photographs of men they barely knew. They were called war brides, brought to a country that had bombed their cities and still despised their faces. The government expected them to stay temporarily, to eventually return home when things normalized. But decades later, when researchers tried to find them, they discovered something unexpected. These women had vanished into America, changed their names, buried their pasts, and refused to leave. This is the story of why they stayed, what they survived, and the secrets they kept until death. August 1945. Tokyo lay in ruins. Yuki Tanaka, 22 years old, stood in the rubble of what had been her family's home. The firebombing had taken her parents, her younger brother, and the small shop where her father had sold rice for 3 generations. Around her, the city smoldered. Smoke rose from collapsed buildings. Bodies still lay under debris. American soldiers patrolled the streets, their boots crunching on broken glass and charred wood. The war was over, but survival had only begun. Yuki had nothing. No family, no home, no job. The entire neighborhood had been flattened. She slept in a makeshift shelter with 40 other women, most of them widows or orphans. They received 1 meal a day from American relief workers, a thin soup with bits of vegetable and sometimes fish. At night they heard stories of women who had found work with the occupation forces, cleaning offices, washing laundry, cooking in mess halls. The pay was small, but it was something. In September, Yuki found work at an American military base outside Tokyo. She cleaned floors, emptied trash bins, scrubbed toilets. The soldiers looked at her with expressions she could not read, somewhere between pity and suspicion. She kept her head down, worked quickly, spoke only when necessary. Her English consisted of 5 words. Yes, no, thank you, sorry, please. That was where she met James Morrison. He was a sergeant from Nebraska, 24 years old, tall and quiet. He did not stare at her the way other soldiers did. He nodded politely when she cleaned his office. One day he left a chocolate bar on the desk with a note that said, "For you." She did not eat it immediately. She saved it for 3 days, breaking off small pieces to make it last. Their courtship, if it could be called that, happened in broken English and hand gestures. James brought her food from the mess hall. She taught him a few Japanese words. They met in the corner of the base where supply trucks parked, away from the eyes of other soldiers and the judgment of Japanese civilians who saw women with Americans as traitors. Within 6 months, James proposed. He did it simply, holding out a small ring and saying, "Come to America with me." Yuki did not answer immediately. She thought of Tokyo, of the ash and hunger and empty spaces where her family had been. She thought of the women in the shelter who grew thinner each week, whose eyes had stopped hoping for anything. She thought of the rumors that Japan would take decades to rebuild, that there were no jobs, no future for women like her. She looked at James, at his honest face and nervous hands, and said yes. The process to leave Japan was brutal. First came the paperwork, applications, photographs, fingerprints, background checks. American officials questioned her for hours. Where was she born? Who were her parents? Had she supported the war effort? Did she have communist sympathies? Had she ever worked in a factory that produced weapons? The questions felt like accusations. She answered carefully, knowing that one wrong word could end everything. Then came the medical examinations. Doctors poked and prodded, checking for diseases, infections, pregnancy. She stood in lines with hundreds of other Japanese women, all waiting to be approved, all hoping their bodies would pass American standards. Some were rejected for tuberculosis, for malnutrition, for conditions they did not even know they had. Yuki watched them leave crying, their American fiancés helpless to intervene. Finally, in March 1947, Yuki received approval. She boarded a military transport ship with 300 other Japanese women. Most were young, in their early 20s. A few were teenagers. They carried small bags with everything they owned. A change of clothes, a photograph, maybe a letter from home. The journey across the Pacific took 2 weeks. Many women were seasick. They huddled below deck, vomiting into buckets, clinging to each other in the darkness. Yuki spent hours on deck watching Japan disappear behind her, wondering if she would ever see it again. When the ship docked in San Francisco, Yuki expected something grand. She had heard stories of America's wealth, its tall buildings and wide streets. Instead, she found suspicion. Immigration officials processed them slowly, checking documents repeatedly, asking the same questions they had answered in Japan. Outside the processing center, some Americans held signs that said, "Japs go home," and "No enemy brides." Yuki did not understand all the words, but she understood the anger in their faces. James met her at the gate. He looked relieved and terrified at the same time. They took a train to Nebraska, a journey that lasted 3 days. Yuki pressed her face to the window, watching America pass by. Mountains, deserts, endless flat plains. Everything was so big, so empty. In Japan, every inch of land was used, crowded with people and buildings. Here she saw miles of nothing but grass and sky. They arrived in Hardington, a small farming town in northeastern Nebraska. Population, 800. James's family lived on a farm outside town, growing corn and raising cattle. When James brought Yuki home, his parents stood on the porch unsmiling. His mother looked her up and down and said nothing. His father shook her hand briefly, his grip cold and formal. His younger sister stared openly as if Yuki were an animal in a zoo. That first night, Yuki lay in the small bedroom James had prepared, listening to voices through the thin walls. She could not understand most of the words, but she heard the tone. Anger, disappointment, betrayal. James's mother was crying. His father's voice was hard and sharp. She heard her own name spoken like a curse. She pulled the blanket over her head and tried not to cry. The town was worse. When Yuki walked down Main Street with James, people stopped talking and stared. Some turned away. Others whispered behind their hands. At the grocery store, the clerk took her money without looking at her face. At church, families moved away when they sat down, leaving an empty circle around them. Children pointed and asked their mothers, "Is she a Jap?" Their mothers pulled them away quickly, as if Yuki carried some contagious disease. Yuki learned quickly that survival meant invisibility. She stopped going into town unless absolutely necessary. She stayed on the farm, working in the garden, cooking meals, cleaning the house. She tried to make herself useful, to prove she deserved to be there. James's mother barely spoke to her. His father gave her orders through James, refusing to address her directly. His sister ignored her completely. The only place Yuki felt safe was in the small bedroom she shared with James. At night, he held her and apologized over and over. "It will get better," he promised. "They just need time." But time passed, and nothing changed. Months became a year, then 2 years. James's family remained cold. The town remained hostile. Yuki learned English by listening to the radio, by reading newspapers James brought home, by practicing words silently when no one could hear her mistakes. In 1949, Yuki gave birth to a son. They named him David. She thought maybe this would change things, that a grandchild would soften James's parents. It did not. His mother held the baby once, briefly, then handed him back without smiling. His father looked at David's face, at the mix of features that marked him as half Japanese, and walked away. Yuki understood then that nothing she did would ever be enough. But David changed everything for Yuki. She looked at her son and knew she could never leave. He was American, born on American soil. He would grow up speaking English, going to American schools, living an American life. If she took him back to Japan, he would be an outsider there too, marked by his mixed heritage, by his American father. There was no going back. There was only forward through whatever came next. Meanwhile, across the country, other Japanese women were making similar discoveries. In California, Keiko Yamamoto had become Katie Williams. She lived in a small apartment in Los Angeles with her husband, Thomas Williams, a Navy mechanic. California had more Japanese Americans than any other state, but that did not make things easier. The internment camps had closed only 2 years before Keiko arrived. The hatred was still fresh, still raw. Keiko found work at a laundry service, pressing shirts and folding sheets for 10 hours a day. The other workers were Mexican and Chinese women who spoke little English. They did not welcome her, but they did not reject her either. They worked in silence, side by side, all of them foreigners trying to survive in a country that did not want them. Thomas was kind, but distant. He worked long hours at the naval shipyard and came home exhausted. They ate dinner in silence, communicated in gestures and short phrases. Keiko realized that their relationship had been built on a fantasy, on the idea of romance in a defeated country, on the promise of escape. Now in the harsh light of American reality, they were strangers living in the same small space. But Keiko was stubborn. She had not survived the firebombing of Osaka, the starvation of the post-war years, the humiliation of the medical examinations and interrogations, only to give up now. She studied English obsessively, listening to radio programs, copying words from newspapers, practicing pronunciation in the bathroom mirror. Within a year, she spoke better English than some of the other laundry workers. Within 2 years, she had lost most of her accent. She also began to erase her past. She stopped speaking Japanese, even to herself. She threw away the few items she had brought from Japan. A silk scarf her mother had given her, a photograph of her family, a small ceramic bowl. She cut her hair short in the American style, bought American clothes, learned to cook American food. She became Katie, completely and deliberately, burying Keiko so deep that sometimes she almost forgot she had ever existed. In 1951, Katie became pregnant. She gave birth to a daughter, Linda. Thomas's family came to visit from Oregon, and Katie saw immediately that they were uncomfortable. They held Linda carefully as if she might break and left after 2 days instead of the planned week. Katie understood. Linda was beautiful, but she did not look fully white. She would grow up between worlds, belonging completely to neither. That realization made Katie's decision final. She would not return to Japan. Linda was American. Her future was here. Katie would make sure of it. She would work harder, speak better English, become more American than the Americans. She would give her daughter every advantage, every opportunity. The past was gone. Only the future mattered. In Montana, Michiko Sato had become Michelle Cooper. She lived on a cattle ranch 50 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by mountains and endless sky. Her husband, Robert Cooper, was a ranch hand, a quiet man who spoke maybe 50 words a day. They lived in a small cabin with no electricity and no running water. Michiko hauled water from a well, cooked on a wood stove, washed clothes by hand in a metal tub. It was the hardest physical work she had ever done, but it was also the most peaceful. There were no neighbors to stare at her, no townspeople to whisper behind her back. Just the land, the animals, and the silence. Robert treated her with a rough kindness, never raising his voice, never asking about her past. They communicated mostly through actions. He brought her firewood, she cooked his meals. They worked side by side in comfortable quiet. Michiko had come from Osaka, from a family that had owned a small textile business before the war. The bombing had destroyed everything. Her father had died in the initial attack. Her mother and 2 younger sisters had starved slowly in the months after, their bodies growing thinner and weaker until they simply stopped moving. Michiko had survived by working in the black market, trading cigarettes and chocolate stolen from American soldiers for rice and vegetables. She had done things she did not like to think about, things she would never speak of. When Robert proposed, she accepted immediately. She did not love him, but she did not need to. He offered escape, safety, a future that did not involve starvation or shame. That was enough, more than enough. On the ranch, Michiko slowly became Michelle. She learned to ride horses, to mend fences, to shoot a rifle to scare off coyotes. She grew strong, her hands calloused and capable. She stopped dreaming in Japanese. She stopped thinking about Osaka, about her family, about the girl she had been before the war. That girl was dead. Michelle was who remained. In 1952, Michelle gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. Robert was overjoyed. He built a larger cabin, with 2 bedrooms and a real kitchen. His parents came to visit from Wyoming, and to Michelle's surprise, they were kind. They did not mention her Japanese heritage. They treated her like any other daughter-in-law, complimenting her cooking and admiring the babies. Michelle realized that distance had saved her. Out here in the middle of nowhere, her race mattered less than her work. She could pull her weight on the ranch. That made her acceptable. But acceptance did not mean belonging. Michelle knew she would always be an outsider, always be different. When they went into town for supplies, people stared. When the children started school, other parents asked uncomfortable questions. Michelle learned to deflect, to smile politely, to reveal nothing. She became an expert at being present but invisible, at existing without taking up space. She also made a deliberate choice. She would never teach her children Japanese. They would grow up completely American, without the burden of her past. She spoke to them only in English, cooked only American food, told them nothing about Japan except that it was where she was born. When they asked questions, she changed the subject. When they pushed, she shut down. Eventually, they stopped asking. In Texas, Tomoko Nakamura had become Tommy Henderson. She lived in a small house on the outskirts of Dallas with her husband, David Henderson, a truck driver. Texas had been particularly hostile. The state still had laws against interracial marriage, though they were rarely enforced against whites and Asians. Still, Tommy and David had to be careful. They did not hold hands in public. They did not attend social events. They kept to themselves. Tommy found work at a garment factory, sewing dresses and blouses for 12 hours a day. The work was repetitive and exhausting, but she was good at it. Her fingers moved quickly. Her stitches were neat and precise. The supervisor, a hard woman named Mrs. Patterson, grudgingly admitted that Tommy was one of her best workers. The other women at the factory were a mix of white, black, and Mexican, all of them poor, all of them working to survive. They did not become friends, but they developed a mutual respect based on shared hardship. Tommy had come from Hiroshima. She had been 17 when the bomb fell. She had been visiting an aunt in the countryside, 20 miles from the city center. When she returned 3 days later, Hiroshima was gone. Just gone. Flattened, burned, erased. She searched for 2 weeks, looking for her parents, her 3 younger brothers, her grandmother. She found nothing. No bodies, no belongings. Nothing. They had simply ceased to exist. The trauma of that search had broken something in Tommy. She stopped feeling things the way she used to. Emotions came to her muted and distant, as if through thick glass. When David proposed, she felt nothing. When she left Japan, she felt nothing. When she arrived in Texas and faced hostility and discrimination, she felt nothing. She had used up all her feelings in those 2 weeks of searching through the ashes of Hiroshima. But in 1953, when she gave birth to a son, something shifted. She looked at his face, at his tiny fingers wrapped around her thumb, and felt a crack in the glass. Love flooded in, sharp and overwhelming. She named him Michael, and she promised him silently that she would give him a better life than she had known. No war, no bombs, no searching through ashes. Just safety, stability, normalcy. That promise meant staying in America, no matter how hard it was. Michael was American. He would grow up with opportunities she had never had. He would go to school, learn a trade, maybe even go to college. He would not know hunger or fear or loss. She would make sure of it. Tommy also made a decision that surprised even her. She would keep some connection to Japan, but secretly. She saved money from her factory wages and bought a small trunk. In it, she placed a few Japanese items: a tea set, a silk kimono, a book of poetry, a photograph of Mount Fuji. She hid the trunk in the attic and told no one about it. It was her secret, her private connection to a past she could not speak about, but could not completely abandon. By the mid-1950s, all 5 women had settled into a pattern. They had learned to survive in America by becoming invisible, by erasing their pasts, by focusing entirely on their children's futures. They worked hard, kept quiet, and asked for nothing. They were model immigrants in the most painful sense. They caused no trouble because they had learned that trouble could get them deported, rejected, or worse. But invisibility came at a cost. Yuki in Nebraska developed chronic headaches that no doctor could explain. Katie in California had nightmares she could not remember when she woke. Michelle in Montana sometimes stood in the middle of the ranch and could not remember how she got there. Tommy in Texas would find herself crying for no reason, tears running down her face while she sewed. They were all carrying trauma they could not process, grief they could not express, losses they could not mourn. In 1956, something shifted. The American government, perhaps feeling guilty about the internment camps, perhaps trying to improve relations with Japan, launched a program to help Japanese war brides integrate. Community centers offered English classes, cultural orientation, support groups. The program was small and underfunded, but it existed. Katie in Los Angeles heard about a support group for Japanese women. She almost did not go. She had worked so hard to become American, to bury Keiko, to forget. But something pulled her there, some need she could not name. The first meeting was in a church basement. 15 Japanese women sat in a circle, most of them around Katie's age. They introduced themselves using their American names, but when they spoke to each other, Japanese words slipped in, tentative and hesitant at first, then flowing more freely. Katie listened to their stories and realized she was not alone. Every woman there had a similar tale: the destruction in Japan, the desperate marriage, the hostile reception in America, the decision to stay for the sake of their children. They had all made the same sacrifices, carried the same secrets, borne the same losses in silence. For the first time in 9 years, Katie spoke about Osaka, about her family's small restaurant, about the night the bombs fell and the building collapsed and she dug through rubble with her bare hands trying to find her younger sister, about the guilt of surviving when so many had died. The words came slowly, painfully, but they came. The other women listened without judgment. Several were crying. When Katie finished, another woman began her story, then another. The support group became a lifeline. Katie went every week. She never told Thomas about it. It was her secret, her private space where she could be Keiko again, if only for an hour. The other women understood things her husband never could, things she could never explain to her American-born daughter. They understood the weight of carrying two identities, the exhaustion of constant translation, the grief of a homeland that no longer existed. Yuki in Nebraska never found such a group. There were no other Japanese women within 100 miles. Her isolation was complete. But in 1958, something unexpected happened. A new family moved to Hardington, a Mexican family who had come north to work in the meatpacking plant. The town treated them the same way they had treated Yuki, with suspicion, hostility, and rejection. Yuki saw the Mexican woman, Rosa, at the grocery store, standing alone while other shoppers avoided her. Something in Yuki recognized something in Rosa. She walked over and said hello. Rosa looked surprised, then grateful. They could barely communicate. Yuki's English was still imperfect. Rosa's was worse. But they managed. They began meeting for coffee once a week at Rosa's house, away from the judging eyes of the town. They did not talk much. Mostly they just sat together, two outsiders finding comfort in shared exclusion. That friendship saved Yuki. It reminded her that she was not alone, that there were others who understood what it meant to be unwanted. Rosa taught her some Spanish. Yuki taught her some Japanese. Their children played together. When James's parents saw this, they were horrified. They told James he needed to control his wife, that she was embarrassing the family by associating with Mexicans. James, to his credit, refused. It was the first time he had stood up to his parents for Yuki. She loved him more in that moment than she ever had before. Michelle in Montana remained isolated. The ranch was too remote for community, too far from any town with other Japanese women. But she found her own form of peace. The land itself became her refuge. She spent hours walking in the mountains, watching the seasons change, observing the animals. She learned the names of plants and birds. She taught herself to paint, using watercolors to capture the landscape. Her paintings were simple but beautiful, filled with the quiet majesty of Montana's wilderness. Robert found her paintings one day and was amazed. He had no idea she had this talent. He framed several and hung them in their cabin. When friends visited, they admired the paintings and asked who the artist was. Robert said proudly, "My wife." Michelle felt a warm glow of recognition. She existed. She had created something. She mattered. In 1960, Michelle's daughter asked her, "Mama, why do you look different from other moms?" Michelle froze. She had known this question would come eventually, but she was not prepared. She sat her daughter down and said simply, "I was born in Japan. That's a country far away across the ocean. I came here to marry your father." Her daughter thought about this and asked, "Will we ever go there?" Michelle said, "No, this is our home now." And she meant it. Tommy in Texas had a different experience. In 1961, her son Michael started school. On his first day, he came home crying. Other children had called him Jap and Chinaman and told him to go back where he came from. Tommy felt a rage she had not felt since Hiroshima. She marched to the school the next day and demanded to speak to the principal. In her heavily accented English, she told him that her son was American, born in Texas, and deserved to be treated with respect. The principal, a tired man named Mr. Harrison, listened and nodded. He could not promise to change the children's attitudes, but he could enforce rules against bullying. It was not enough, but it was something. That incident forced Tommy to make a decision. She could not protect Michael by hiding. She had to teach him to be strong, to be proud of who he was. She began telling him stories about Japan, carefully edited versions that left out the war and the bomb and the death. She told him about beautiful temples and cherry blossoms and festivals. She taught him a few Japanese words. She showed him the trunk in the attic, the one she had kept hidden for years. Michael was fascinated. He wanted to know everything. Tommy found herself remembering things she thought she had forgotten. Her grandmother's laugh, her father's calligraphy, the taste of mochi her mother made for New Year's. The memories hurt, but they also healed. She was reclaiming her past, not as a burden but as a gift to give her son. The 1960s brought change to America. The civil rights movement challenged racial segregation and discrimination. New laws were passed. Attitudes slowly began to shift. It was not a revolution for Japanese Americans. The focus was primarily on Black Americans, but it created space for other conversations about race and belonging. Katie in Los Angeles became involved in the Japanese American community. She helped organize cultural festivals, taught Japanese language classes to second-generation children, and spoke at schools about her experience. She was careful in what she shared, still protecting herself, but she was no longer completely invisible. Her daughter Linda, now a teenager, was proud of her mother's heritage. She wanted to learn Japanese, to visit Japan, to understand where she came from. Katie found this both terrifying and hopeful. Yuki in Nebraska saw less change. Small farming towns moved slowly. But her son David grew up to be a kind and thoughtful young man. He defended his mother when people made racist comments. He learned some Japanese from a book he ordered from the library. He told Yuki that he was proud of her strength and courage. Those words meant more to Yuki than anything else in her life. Michelle in Montana watched her children grow into capable adults. Her son became a ranch manager. Her daughter became a teacher. Both of them left Montana for college and careers, but they came back to visit regularly. They brought their own children, Michelle's grandchildren, who loved the ranch and the mountains, and their grandmother's quiet strength. Michelle realized that she had created something lasting, a family, a legacy, a place in this vast country. Tommy in Texas saw her son Michael graduate from high school in 1971. He was smart and ambitious. He won a scholarship to the University of Texas. Tommy cried at his graduation, not from sadness but from overwhelming pride. She had kept her promise. She had given him a better life. He would never have to dig through ashes looking for his family. He would never have to flee his homeland. He would never have to erase himself to survive. But as the women aged, they also began to reflect on the costs of their choices. Katie, now in her 40s, sometimes looked in the mirror and wondered who she was. Was she Katie or Keiko, American or Japanese? She had spent so long being what others needed her to be that she had lost track of what she wanted for herself. The question haunted her. Yuki, also in her 40s, realized that she had not spoken to anyone from Japan in over 25 years. Her family was gone, but there had been friends, cousins, neighbors. What had happened to them? Were any of them still alive? She would never know. She had cut all ties, burned all bridges. The isolation felt heavier as she aged. Michelle, approaching 50, began to have dreams about Osaka. In the dreams, her family was alive. Her mother was cooking in their kitchen. Her sisters were laughing. Her father was reading the newspaper. She would wake up crying, the loss fresh and raw as if it had happened yesterday instead of decades ago. She had never properly mourned. She had been too busy surviving. Tommy, in her late 40s, found herself thinking about Hiroshima more and more. She had never spoken about the bomb, not even to Michael. It was too big, too terrible, but it lived inside her, a constant weight. She began to wonder if she should tell someone, if she should leave some record of what she had witnessed. But who would believe her? Who would understand? In 1975, the Vietnam War ended. America's relationship with Asia was changing again. There was more awareness of Asian Americans, more visibility, more conversation. But for the war brides, it was too late. They were in their 50s now, their identities long established, their choices long made. They could not go back and reclaim what they had given up. They could only go forward. Yuki's husband James died in 1978. He had a heart attack while working on the farm. Yuki was 55 years old, and suddenly she was alone in a way she had not been since before the war. James's family did not reach out. The town still kept its distance. Her son David tried to convince her to move to Omaha, where he now lived with his own family. But Yuki refused. The farm was her home. She had earned it through decades of hard work and endurance. She would not leave. Living alone, Yuki began to write. She filled notebooks with her memories, writing in a mix of English and Japanese, the two languages flowing together. She wrote about Tokyo before the war, about her family, about the bombing, about the desperate years after. She wrote about James, about Nebraska, about the loneliness and the small moments of joy. She did not know what she would do with these notebooks. Maybe nothing. Maybe they were just for her, a way of organizing the chaos of her life into something that made sense. Katie's husband Thomas died in 1982. He had lung cancer from years of working with asbestos at the shipyard. Katie was 59. Her daughter Linda was married with children of her own. Katie sold the apartment in Los Angeles and moved to San Diego, where Linda lived. For the first time in her life, Katie had the freedom to be whoever she wanted. She joined a Japanese cultural center, took ikebana classes, learned to wear a kimono properly. She was reclaiming Keiko, carefully and deliberately, integrating her into Katie. Michelle's husband Robert died in 1985. He was thrown from a horse and broke his neck. Michelle was 63. The ranch was too much for her to manage alone, so she sold it and moved into town, into a small house near her daughter. For the first time in almost 40 years, Michelle had neighbors. She was visible again. It was uncomfortable at first, but she adjusted. She started painting again, more seriously this time. A local gallery displayed her work. People bought her paintings. She signed them Michelle Cooper. But sometimes, in the corner, she added a small Japanese character, her family name, Sato. Tommy's husband David died in 1990. He had a stroke while driving his truck. Tommy was 67. Her son Michael was a successful engineer, married with 3 children. He invited Tommy to live with his family and she accepted. It was strange, being part of a busy household after so many years of quiet. But she loved watching her grandchildren grow, loved teaching them small things about Japanese culture, loved seeing them embrace both sides of their heritage without shame. The 1990s brought new attention to the war brides. Historians began researching their stories. Documentaries were made. Books were published. Some of the women were interviewed, their experiences finally recorded and validated. But many, like Yuki and Michelle and Tommy, remained private. They had spent their entire lives being invisible. They were not ready to be seen. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the end of World War II, there were ceremonies and commemorations. Katie was invited to speak at an event in Los Angeles about the Japanese-American experience. She almost declined, but Linda convinced her. Katie stood in front of 100 people and told her story. She used both names, Keiko and Katie, claiming both identities. She spoke about loss and survival, about the price of belonging, about the strength it takes to rebuild a life from nothing. When she finished, the audience stood and applauded. Many were crying. Katie felt something release inside her, some burden she had carried for 50 years. Yuki in Nebraska never spoke publicly. But in 1998, a local historian writing a book about the county's history heard about her and asked for an interview. Yuki was 75 years old. She agreed, but only if the interview was private, not published until after her death. She spent 6 hours talking, telling her story in full for the first time. The historian recorded everything. When they finished, Yuki felt exhausted, but lighter, as if she had set down a heavy suitcase she had been carrying for decades. Michelle in Montana was approached by her grandchildren in 2000. They were doing a school project about family history and wanted to know about her life in Japan. Michelle, now 78, sat them down and told them everything. About Osaka, about the war, about the starvation, about the difficult decision to leave. She showed them photographs she had kept hidden for years. She taught them a few Japanese words. Her grandchildren were amazed. They had known their grandmother was from Japan, but they had not known the depth of her story, the weight of what she had survived. Tommy in Texas began to write her memoir in 2005. She was 82 years old and her health was failing. She wanted to leave a record for her grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She wrote about Hiroshima, about the bomb, about the 2 weeks of searching through the ashes. She wrote about David, about Texas, about the hard years and the small victories. She wrote about the decision to stay, about what she had given up and what she had gained. She finished the memoir in 2007 and gave copies to her family. Some of them cried reading it. Some of them could not finish it. All of them understood her better. Katie died in 2010 at the age of 87. She had lived long enough to see her grandchildren graduate from college, to see Japanese culture become mainstream in America, to see sushi restaurants on every corner. She died peacefully in her sleep, with her daughter Linda holding her hand. At her funeral, people spoke in both English and Japanese. She was remembered as both Katie and Keiko, both identities honored and celebrated. Yuki died in 2018 at the age of 95. She had lived alone on the farm until the very end, stubborn and independent. Her son David found her notebooks after her death. He read them and wept. He had known his mother was strong, but he had not known the full extent of what she had endured. He donated the notebooks to a historical archive, where they would be preserved for future generations. The local historian published excerpts in his book. Yuki's voice, silent for so long, finally spoke. Michelle died in 2015, at the age of 93. She had spent her final years surrounded by family, painting until her hands could no longer hold a brush. Her children donated her paintings to a museum in Montana. An exhibition was held in her honor. The paintings, with their quiet depictions of mountains and sky, were recognized as remarkable works of art. The small Japanese character in the corner of each painting, the name Sato, reminded viewers that the artist had come from somewhere else, had carried a hidden history in every brushstroke. Tommy died in 2020, at the age of 97. She had lived long enough to see her great-great-grandchildren, to see the world change in ways she could never have imagined. She died during the COVID pandemic, quietly and alone in a hospital room, but her family held a memorial service later when restrictions lifted. Her son Michael read passages from her memoir. Her grandchildren shared stories. Her great-grandchildren, who barely knew her, were amazed by her strength and resilience. These 4 women, and thousands like them, never returned to Japan. They had come to America in 1947 and 1948, young and scared and desperate. They had been called war brides, enemy brides, unwanted guests. They had faced discrimination, isolation, and erasure. They had survived by becoming invisible, by burying their pasts, by sacrificing their identities for their children's futures. But they had also built something. They had created families, raised children, contributed to their communities. They had carried 2 cultures inside them, even when only one was visible. They had been bridges between worlds, translators of experience, keepers of memory. Their strength was quiet, but immense. Their legacy was not in grand gestures, but in the everyday act of survival, of choosing to stay, of refusing to give up. The Japanese women who came to America after World War II and refused to leave were not rebels or revolutionaries. They were survivors. They made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. They paid enormous prices for those choices, but they endured. And in enduring, they changed America, one small invisible life at a time. Their stories, finally being told, remind us that history is not just made by the loud and the powerful. It is also made by the quiet and the persistent, by those who survive and stay and build even when no one is watching.